What's up, brothers? This is your brother G World 7_D. Here's a book, A People's History of Florida, 1530 to 1876. How Africans, Seminoles, women, and lower-class whites shaped the Sunshine State. Now, actually, that's a bunch of BS, but and I want you to pick up on certain things that I'm about to read. These just disgusting, filthy, lying-ass, treacherous devils will do anything and say anything to distort history. They're just some compulsive liars. Alright? Turn to page 97. And I want to focus on something right here. I'm going to go 97. Alright? Yeah. But that shows you two so-called free black militia members, including an officer from Veracruz and a soldier from Havana, from Havana, Cuba. All right, but I'm gonna read you some stuff, and I want you to pick up on certain things, okay? Let me get it clear. I'm just gonna straight read it, but it's gonna come up clear. Unable to tolerate St. Augustine's offer of freedom any longer, the British declared war on the Spanish Florida to the Carolinas. St. Augustine was a den of thieves and ruffian, receptacle of debtors, servants, and slaves, bane of industry and society. By late December, Georgia Governor James Oglethorpe initiated attacks on several of the outposts on the St. Johns River west of St. Augustine. General Oglethorpe was abundantly clear about the main objective of British exclusion, and I do further declare that all Negroes which have deserted from South Carolina, which shall be taken in Florida during the said expedition, shall be delivered up to their respective owners on paying a sterling per head to the captors. Now I want you to understand that. Watch where I read this next line, man. It's how slick these lying-ass devils are, man. You got to pick up on this. All right. The Florida governor organized militias of Yamasee Native allies, Spanish soldiers, and free blacks of those who are fugitives from the English colonies. So, the Florida governor organized militias of Yamasee Native allies, Spanish soldiers, and free blacks of those who are fugitives from the English colonies. These militias were essential for making reconnaissance missions around the province and gathering intelligence on British movements. Blacks and natives were also employed in strengthening the defense of Castillo de San Marcos in St. Augustine in preparation for the British assault. Montano formed a regiment of fugitive blacks from Fort Mose, who appointed their officers, received the same pay, and wore the same uniform as the Spanish soldiers. Now, you know how that bastard just tried to make two different groups or three different groups of black people into a different race. He just said the Yamasee Native allies, Spanish soldiers, many of them, I guess, Negro conquistadors, and then free blacks of those who are fugitives from the English colonies. Now, the free blacks and Yamasees are actually the same race, but he just separated and made them different race. So you have your blacks, and then you have your Indians, but your Indians, they're making it as if they're not black. You really gotta pick up on these. That's how deceiving and racist and dirty these bastards are, man. It's disgusting how racist they are. But I'm gonna go up, man. That's what I want you to pick up on. In January 1740, the British gained several victories, capturing Spanish forts Picolata, Pupo, on the St. Johns River west of St. Augustine. Oglethorpe garrisoned a force at Fort Francis on the St. Johns River, which was strategically located at a necessary passing point for disaffected Indians out of the nation, or runaway slaves, from Carolinas, traveling to St. Augustine. Now the only obstacle in the way of St. Augustine was Mos. The British blockaded St. Augustine from the coast and gathered their soldiers and native allies to seize the city. A full blockade was initiated to starve out the inhabitants. In May, a British lieutenant captured 2 blacks he found outside of St. Augustine, who had withdrawn from the city due to the starving conditions. In the meantime, the pro-British natives made slave raids up and down the Florida coast. In the meantime, the pro-British natives made slave raids up and down the Florida coast, meaning the Negro Indians, forcing Mankato to withdraw the blacks from Fort Mose and into St. Augustine. Colonel James Palmer persistently volunteered to personally destroy Fort Mose with his own regiment, but General Oglethorpe repeatedly refused his request. In 1728, Palmer had been driven back by the black militias in his assault on St. Augustine and was particularly determined to avenge the humiliation he had received. Against the Oglethorpe's orders, Palmer's regiment leveled the empty settlement and set up there for further attacks on St. Augustine. But the British forces found themselves without the necessary means to actually overrun the city. Over the previous decades, excuse me, something in my throat, God, dog. St. Augustine had improved its defenses in anticipation of a British invasion from the coast or inland. The towns were entrenched with 10 salient angles on each of which at least 1 cannon was mounted. 50 cannons pieces were mounted on the nearly impeccable Castillo de San Marcos, several of which were 24-pounders. The city was protected by a force of 700 to 800, consisting of 462 Spanish regulars and nearly equivalent militia force of blacks, excuse me, Yamasis, and whites. Blacks, Yamasis, and whites. Okay, the Yamasis or the Yamasis were Negroes. They were black. You see how these guys they try to separate the two. They're black. These are the same damn people. One may be, you see, black Europeans, or just these Aboriginal blacks. You see what they're doing? During the siege of St. Augustine, Mankato also desperately begged the king to provide him with a 300-man black regiment from Cuba for assistance. Most of St. Augustine population bunkered down in Castillo for the siege. The free black and native militias, 2 Negro groups, carried on an intense guerrilla war against the encampment British forces. A British report claimed that many of St. Augustine inhabitants were mulattoes of savage disposition, and that their militia forces were equivalent to the number of regular Spanish troops. The turning point of the war was the Spanish reconquest of Fort Mose from Colonel John Palmer's regiment that had a garrison there. On June 25th, Governor Mankato detached a 300-man regiment comprised of Spanish regulars, militiamen, Yamasis, and free blacks to dislodge the 170-man force of British and native allies at Mose under Palmer. Okay, like I said before, the free blacks and Yamasis, these are both blacks. The attacks was initiated 2 hours before the British soldiers awoke. So that they could not prepare their arms for defense. The Spanish detachment quickly swept over the camp, leaving 68 dead and capturing 34 soldiers. The blacks brutally mutilated the bodies of the dead soldiers. The English account reported in horror that the Spanish excursion cut off the heads and private parts of the dead and brought them back to St. Augustine in triumph. The Spanish account also included a native prisoner at Fort Mose who had reported seeing Colonel Palmer dead and decapitated. This may have been the result of a pact that the fugitive slaves made with the Spanish king, promising to be the most cruel enemies of the English. At the end of the bloody battle, the blacks and Spanish retook Fort Mose. By July 10th, the British, finding their forces exhausted and the chances of taking St. Augustine minimal, retreated back to Georgia. Mantaeno commanded the Free Black Militia for their bravery. All right, in protecting St. Augustine, the constancy, valor, and glory of the officers here are beyond all praise. The patriotism, courage, and steadiness of the troops, militia, free Negroes, and convicts have been great. These last, I may say, to your excellency, have borne themselves like veteran soldiers. I especially commend their humble devotion, for without ceasing work by day, they have preserved by night with the care and vigilance of old soldiers. Even among the slaves, a particular steadiness has been noticed, and a desire not to await the enemy in the place, but to go out to meet him. The Free Black Militias had successfully warded off the full-scale British invasion. Although most was destroyed in the 1740 siege, the Free Blacks will reside in St. Augustine for the next decade as Spanish citizens. In 1742, they played a central role in the failed Spanish counterattack against Georgia. Afterwards, the British colonies in Spanish Florida were in somewhat of a stalemate. For the next 2 decades, the Free Blacks continued to repel isolated native and British raids against St. Augustine. In 1749, Melchor de Navarrete replaced Mantaeno as governor of Spanish Florida and ordered Fort Mose to be rebuilt as a settlement for the Free Blacks in St. Augustine. In 1752, Navarrete's successor, Fugenico Garcia de Solos, met resistance from the Free Blacks in St. Augustine when he attempted to relocate them into the reconstructed settlement. The blacks claimed that they feared the attacks of pro-British natives, but the governor believed it emanated from their desire to live to complete liberty. It didn't occur to Spanish governor that both could possibly be true, considering the native parties were consistently soaring Spanish Florida for slaves. The Free Blacks of Spanish Florida wished to have freedom of movement and choice of resistance, rights that their fellow residents of St. Augustine enjoyed, believing that their valuable militia service more than entitled them to basic rights of citizenship. While daily life at St. Augustine was far from glamorous, the hardships encountered at Fort Mose made daily living difficult. At Fort Mose, they were little more than semi-free tributaries to the Spanish Florida government. While they were free citizens of rights in St. Augustine, Garcia de Solis lightly punished the 2 leaders of the resistance and threatened even worse punishment to any who would continue to resist. From 1740s to the end of the Spanish rule over Florida in 1763, slaves continued to run away from the Carolinas to St. Augustine's safeguard. Mose was abandoned in 1763, when Spanish Florida was formally ceded over to the British from Spain. A huge exodus of Spaniards, Free Blacks, and Native allies left for Cuba to escape the prospects of British rule. The introduction of British colonialism to Florida meant the establishment of chattel slavery and rigid race-based slave codes. During the period of British rule, some free blacks from St. Augustine, who had already long established ties with natives in Florida interior, were incorporated into the forming nucleus of the Seminole tribe. The organic formation of the Oconnees, Lower Creeks, Yamasees, and various forms of native Floridian tribes into what would later be called the Seminole Nation, had already incorporated runaway slaves from the late 17th century. Fugitive slaves escaping to the sparsely populated swamps of North and Central Florida will now find a safe haven in the Seminole rather than the provincial authorities. Now let's stop right there. Let's stop right there. I showed you before the Creeks were originally Negroes, the Oconees, the Yamasees, okay, Tallahassee, the Appalachians. These are the same Negroes, and he just explained in his book how that's where the Seminoles come from. Now let me tell you something, man. This is how these bastards write these books. They try to make the one group of blacks a different race, because they said Yamasee natives, and the Yamasee are Aboriginal black people. Then they talking about free blacks, escaped slaves. So they use the term black for the slaves, and then they did the Yamasee and made them a totally different category, man. When they both were so-called black people. You gotta understand the tricks of the trade. And then I told you before about the Florida Indians, man. Like the Tiamuqua. I told you how they look, how them Negroes had Jackson 5 style afros, and they congregate in the South, Florida, all through the Southeast, all right. But the Tiamuqua were in Florida, but you have all those great black tribes in the Southeast, all over this country. But this folks is in the Southeast. You notice how the author kept saying Yamasee natives and free blacks. What are you talking about? Both of them were black. But you making a Yamasee, like I said, a so-called different race. That he's different from the so-called free blacks. You see how they write this stuff? This is how they write you out of your history. This is why I say it's so important for you to identify with being Aboriginal. And you use a term like African American, you make yourself a foreigner in a land that you're indigenous to or you're Aboriginal to. So that's why that Umar Johnson stuff talking about pretendians and all that, he's ignorant, man, because he really don't know true black history. He's just going off that slave narrative. But he's not talking about how I mentioned in his book, how they was going through Florida looking for slaves. And it was going after many of those black Aboriginal tribes. Yes, you had some black people who weren't enslaved and it was escaping and mixing in with other blacks. All he was just saying is that you have Aboriginal blacks, you have other blacks mixing in with them. This is why I don't understand why so many brothers and sisters find this hard to understand. Most of us are descendants of the black people already here. You didn't need to go to Africa to get slaves. Even I'm not saying that they didn't get slaves from Africa, but most of our people are already here. And then a large number of them came from Europe. You have to understand. This is why it's important to do serious research. And then look at the the trickologies that these white scholars use. Yamasees and free blacks. When the Yamasees were black, or so-called black. You see what they're doing? You see the tricks with how they're doing? But I'm not saying that you can't get no good information out of this book, because you can. But this is the type of stuff that these white folks will do. And this is written by a so-called liberal. Alright? So this is how these white folks get down, man. These people are trying to, they've done their best to hijack and steal your history. That goes back to that Cleopatra stuff, man. I said it before in the last video. That woman was black. Period. And any Negro who try to tell you she wasn't black, don't know what the hell they talking about. The Macedonians were black, / Greeks were black, and the original Romans were black. They were all Negroes, man. That whole region was Negro. G.J. Campbell Dunn talks about that in his books called The African Classical Origin of Europe. I think that's the name of the book. Or the African Classical Origin of Europe, where the Pelasgians were the original Greeks, man. The original black Greeks. Pelasgians. So I want brothers and sisters, my throat, man, my nose got stopped up too a little bit. But I want brothers and sisters to understand, man. Do the research and information's there. I just read you about a lot of these black tribes. You should pick up some of these names, man. Okanis, Tallahassee, Yamasi, Okanis, Yamasis, Tallahassee, Appalachies. Come on, man. This is in your face, dude. This is in your face, brothers and sisters. This information is damn smack in your damn face. It's right there. It's right there smack in your face, man, who you really are. And Tiamuqua people, like I said before, those Negroes rock the big fro, man. I mean, they rock the natural fro. There's nothing straight about there. And like I always say, the black folks come in very different type of hair texture. But those brothers and sisters, man, rock the natural fro. I want you to understand this. I want you to get out there, man, saying you were descendant of African slaves. You have to stop that. And they got too many Negroes on YouTube pushing that mess, man. They don't know what the hell they're talking about. So, A People's History of Florida, 1530 to 1876. How Africans, Seminoles, women, and lower class whites shaped the Sunshine State. Okay, whatever. But it still is an interesting book to get, man. All right, brothers and sisters, it's still an interesting book to get, man. All right, man. Peace and love.